Hey guys, tonight we step into a world without insulated windows, electric blankets, or central heating. A medieval winter where every frosty gust rattles through crooked timbers and chills you right down to your soul. The night is black as pitch, the cold fierce enough to bite your cheeks like some cranky wolf, and the frozen air so sharp that the simplest breath feels like chipping icicles inside your chest. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry, your imagination's immune to frostbite. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you drop your location and current local time in the comments. You'd be amazed to see this little community stretching across so many corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across a field of snow slick and glinting with moonlight, your boots little more than leather wrapped tight with twine, and the wind knifes through you like it's got a personal vendetta. There's no comforting hum of traffic in the background, no glow of lamps in the distance. Medieval nights are pitch black voids, a star-flecked roof overhead, silence broken only by animals restless in their stalls and your own crunching steps. That silence can be scary, but also grounding, like the world shrinks down to you and the cold. Now, you'd assume medieval winters were a kind of rustic snow, globe idle, picturesque cottages and firelight. The reality, brutal fact one. Europe's so-called Little Ice Age, from about the 14th to 19th centuries, actually made winters harsher than you'd expect, with rivers freezing over so solidly that festivals were held on the ice itself. Historians still argue whether climate change alone was the big villain here, or whether medieval farming methods and deforestation made winters harsher by robbing soil of resilience. Either way, you're in thick of it now, trying desperately to keep warm with resources so pitiful you'd give anything for a modern fleece hoodie. The biggest challenge is temperature, of course, but not in the cozy, it's sweater weather sense. Inside your flimsy wattle and daub cottage, the air hangs damp and heavy, chilled by the stone floor, fouled by smoke from a fire that struggles to stay alive without proper chimneys. Even in summer, peasants' homes weren't plush, so imagine them in February. You could sleep near the fire, but there's a constant chance of sparks catching or neighbors clambering past, because folks didn't live in sprawling houses. Many slept shoulder to shoulder with family, plus chickens huddled in corners to add a little extra body heat. Yes, chickens' medieval living hot water bottles, who at least clucked if things were about to catch fire. Quirky tidbit. There's evidence some communities would literally bury heated stones in straw-filled beds to trap warmth. Imagine tucking into a bed that's basically a prehistoric electric blanket, except it cools down in a few minutes, and you smack your foot on a sharp corner if you roll wrong. And still, it was better than nothing. Through the window slits, or more realistically, open gaps where glass is still centuries away for common folk, you hear the wind wail like wolves. Sometimes winters got too dramatic. Think about the River Thames in London, frozen to a thickness that could support entire fairs with stalls, musicians, and even ox roasting on the ice. Laughter, roasted meat smells, and jugglers on skates now. That is medieval adaptation to the cold. Still, while fairs are fun once the novelty fades, you're left with famine lurking, livestock starving, and folks shivering to exhaustion. Every move outside means layering every scrap you own to. Wool spun coarse and annoyingly itchy, patched furs if you're a bit luckier, and battered shoes stuffed with straw for insulation. Still, toes go numb fast, fingers even faster. Try carrying buckets of water, you clutch the wooden staves, and your knuckles crack and split from frost, making the task sting as if each drop of water is laced with salt. Helpful. No, hilarious to someone watching you juggle icy pails, probably. Nothing gets a medieval neighbor chuckling faster than somebody slipping in slush. Slapstick comedy for the frostbitten age. You crave light too, but candles are expensive luxuries. Beeswax was reserved for churches or wealthy households, so you deal with dim, smoky tallow lamps rendered from animal fat. The smell, the flicker, weak. Still, it beats stumbling around in absolute dark, tripping over goats, or misplacing the chamber pot. A scenario funny now, but probably disastrous then. And food. You chew bread hard as stone, baked weeks ago and softened by soaking in thin broth. Sometimes meat salted to near jerky levels, sometimes not available at all. Winter often robs bellies as much as limbs of comfort, but hunger will explore more in the next part. For now, the cold alone is enough to make you clench every muscle in defiance, teeth rattling like castanets. Even nobility weren't immune. True, lords had more firewood, bigger hearths, thicker walls, yet castles were drafty stone refrigerators. Toes froze in grand halls just as easily as in peasant huts. Those servants' fire, tending made the difference between tolerable and unbearable. Fur-lined cloaks and embroidered slippers looked elegant, sure, but you're still pacing on icy flagstones. Plus bathing in winter. Almost non-existent, water was frigid, baths rare, and steam impossible to trap, so hygiene took a nap until spring. You smell medieval society before you see it. Historians still argue whether winters united communities through hardship, bonding families as they huddled close, or divided them when resources ran thin and hoarding set in. There's little doubt it shaped medieval psychology. Life is fragile, survival precious, and generosity might mean someone's lives another week. You can almost picture villagers burying their noses under blankets, muttering prayers, waiting for dawn like it's salvation itself. And through this icy silence, you start to understand winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. No internet shopping for scarves, no indoor heating, no Netflix to distract you from frost aching in your marrow. Just grit, community when possible, and acceptance that every winter night was survival on a knife's edge. You wake to a brittle dawn, your breath puffing in pale plumes, and the fire burned down to its grumpy red embers. The gnawing ache in your stomach now rivals the ache in your frozen fingers. Winter doesn't just frost the air, it cuts straight to your insides, stripping you of sustenance with a relentless patience. Hunger in these months is a companion, as familiar as the snow beneath your boots. By this point in the season, the little stores of summer feel laughably inadequate. Medieval people relied heavily on the previous autumn's harvest, lugging barrels of salted fish, drying herbs, storing meager sacks of grain in lofts, and praying rodents wouldn't turn those grain sacks into 5-star mouse hotels. By January or February, reserves looked more like dusty crumbs than cornucopia feasts. Bread, supposed to be the staff of life, often wasn't made from pure wheat anymore, but filler, grains like rye or barley, which came with their own hazards. Fact, rye sometimes contained ergot fungus during damp storage, sparking outbreaks of ergotism, popularly called St. Anthony's fire, where hallucinations and gangrene cursed villages. Imagine trudging through the snow half-starved and convinced you're being chased by fire-breathing goats. Worst Christmas party ever. Still, bread was survival. Sometimes, when the grain bins were nearly empty, peasants padded out dough with things like acorns or chestnuts ground to powder. Fringe tidbit. During especially cruel winters, desperate families made what's known as bark bread, literally stripping the inner bark from trees, drying it, grinding it, and mixing it into loaves. You know that trendy artisan bread with toppings like pine nuts? Well, medieval desperation bread accented with actual pine bark. A flavor profile only a squirrel could love. The trouble goes deeper than taste. Livestock needed fodder too, and thin stacks of hay ran out well before the frost receded. Cows grew gaunt, goats shivered miserably, chickens laid fewer eggs. Famine became cyclical. If animals weakened and died, you lost next year's milk, eggs, even plowing power. Catch 2-2. Do you slaughter for emergency food now, or gamble on survival through spring? Historians still argue whether peasant strategies leaned more towards slaughtering weak animals early or enduring hardship in hopes of preserving herds. Either way, the crunching you hear at night may be less snow, more empty stomachs twisting. To soften the monotony, winter diets leaned hard into preservation. salting fish until your tongue shriveled like a raisin, smoking strips of meat in low huts, fermenting cabbage into pungent sauerkraut that at least got you through scurvy danger. Cheese aged in cellars helped too, tangy and hearty enough to outlast bitter winds. Still, supplies dwindled. A story from Northern Europe mentions peasants boiling leather scraps when the snow lingered late, praying warm soup might hide the fact it was really shoe stew. Bon appétit. You step outside, through crunching snow toward the village square, as if hunger might somehow be cured communally. Neighbors gather, wrapping shawls tightly, cradling thin mugs of broth, talking little because energy, like food, must be rationed. Children sometimes scampered about oblivious, tossing snow lumps at each other, but they too weakened when rations thinned. In some chronicles, hard winters were remembered less for storms and more for famines. People didn't describe the coldest year, but the year we ate nettles. Among nobility, circumstances improved only marginally. Castles stockpiled more food, sure, but nobles still knew the bite of famine. Overseers rationed grain carefully, servants stretched flour, and even grand feasts became rarer in harder winters. But when they did hold feasts, the extravagance contrasted sharply with peasant struggle. Imagine gnawing bark bread in a mud hut while hearing rumors that across the hill, venison roasts sizzled under vaulted ceilings. Not exactly morale boosting. Adding to the stomach pits were religious rules, fasting periods punctuated winter, dictated by the church calendar. Not eating meat during Lent, for example, pressed thin diets even thinner. The irony, the rules fell on already starved people. Some loosened these fasts privately, whispering apologies afterward. Others clung fiercely, believing their suffering paid spiritual dividends. Here again, scholars argue, was religious fasting primarily a burden, or could it have unintentionally rationed scarce meat to help households last longer? Survival disguised as sanctity. Hunger does strange things to a mind. Diaries and accounts recall people dreaming vivid feasts where tables groaned with bread and butter, only to cough awake on a straw bed. And yet, oddly, communities found creativity. When flour ran low, they made porridge soups, throwing in peas, onions, maybe wild garlic scraped from frozen ground. During lean years, a liquid meal of grain, served as both drink and sustenance, weak in alcohol but at least nutrient-rich. Folks joked that covered 2 meals. Not wrong, if by meal you mean thin comfort that blurs hunger pangs. You slip back into that smoky cottage where your family waits, and the hunger feels more tangible than the frost. You can hear it in the coughs of the frail, the sighs of mothers doling out slivers of bread to squabbling children, saving the larger pieces for working adults who needed strength for woodcutting. Even laughter changes, it's thinner, less timely, but oddly precious. A joke about the rabbit stew, missing the rabbit, might earn chuckles, because humor keeps despair at bay when your stomach has been an empty drum for weeks. Historians paint famine as the shadow of winter in medieval Europe. Whether triggered by poor harvest, the Little Ice Age, or war-disrupting supply lines, hunger meant winter was remembered not just as cold but as cruel. Some winters left legends, not of heroic knights, but of households who made it through on boiled roots and sheer stubbornness. You realize hunger wasn't a side effect of winter, it was winter, lodged right alongside the frost in people's bones. So you go to bed, fighting a growl in your belly, knowing tomorrow's challenge isn't just finding warmth, it's finding enough calories to earn another dawn. Winter here is not a snow globe miracle. It's a test with a scoring system based entirely on your pantry. The hunger follows you into the next morning, but now you start noticing something else. The walls around you do little to help. As if the winter wasn't already brutal enough on your belly, the very place you hide in is practically designed to betray you. These are homes that seem to laugh in the face of insulation. You sit shivering, wrapped tight in wool that scratches more than it soothes, and glance around at a structure meant more for keeping out wolves than for keeping in warmth. Cottages in the medieval countryside are far from storybook perfect. Most are slapped together with timber frames stuffed with wattle and daub, that is, sticks woven like a basket and smeared over with clay, mud, and dung. Yes, dung, nature's version of spackle, but one that heats poorly and cracks as the frost sets in. Instead of thick shutters, many windows are openings covered, if lucky, with animal hide parchment, and when wind blows, the house wheezes and sighs like a chain, smoking dragon. In the corner sits a hearth, open and smoky, recalling more campfire indoors than central heating. You lean close to it, your clothes soaking up sparks, your face scorched by heat even as your back and feet stubbornly freeze. You might think castles had it easier, but let's not get cozy too quickly. True, castles rise in stone might, but that means they're basically refrigerated fortresses. Sitting in a great hall in December feels like huddling at the bottom of a giant well lined with icicles. Yes, you had tapestries, vivid woven stories hung along walls to insulate air pockets. But even the grandest halls never quite achieved coziness. Drafts still sneaked through arrow slits, and wind still rode across bare courtyards. Lords and ladies often retreated to smaller chambers, clutching braziers, portable little fire bowls of burning coal, like clumsy hand warmers. A romantic winter in a castle turret, more like a week long nose drip with bonus smoke inhalation. Fact check. Archaeologists studying medieval dwellings found that lightless interiors were smoky enough to shorten lives. Respiratory distress was common, partly from damp and partly from constant inhale of smoke curling unfiltered out of crude hearths. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was risky. Historians still argue whether chronic indoor smoke contributed significantly to higher mortality in winter months, beyond hunger and disease. The data's murky, but the discomfort is obvious. Picture coughing yourself sore while still freezing in the same breath. Warmth or breath, pick one. Quirky tidbit. Some inventive households resorted to literally plastering animal hides directly across interior walls as makeshift fur wallpaper. It added precious insulation, and if you didn't mind your house smelling faintly like a wet barn, it also kept plaster from flaking on your head mid-dinner. A medieval decorator's delight. Hearth placement was another gamble. In smaller cottages, the hearth lay in the very center, with no chimney to draw the smoke out. Instead, it drifted up to blackened rafters, then wriggled lazily through holes in the thatched roof. That meant every single corner of your home was both smoked and chilled. Furniture, such as it was, provided little relief. Simple benches, maybe a straw, stuffed mattress in the corner. Even that mattress often froze stiff along edges, where damp seeped straight from the ground. The phrase "sleep tight" suddenly sounds less like a friendly farewell and more like a desperate plea not to freeze onto the mattress. It wasn't just humans crowding into this space. Remember the chickens from earlier? They're here again, fussing in the corners, occasionally taking a turn roosting on the ladder up to your crude loft sleeping space. Goats sometimes join too, bleating unhappily. Their body heat great in theory, but less so when one tipped your water pail. You did what you had to. Your home was your livestock's home, because keeping them alive through winter was half your survival plan. Smell was, well, robust, but nobody judged everyone reeked equally by February. Nobles had luxury variations, layered floors with carpets, rooms with shutters, sometimes even rudimentary glass in the wealthiest estates. But warmth was still a daydream. Medieval glass was uneven, bubbled, and expensive, only covering tiny windows. Even kings perched near fireplaces so big you could walk inside. But unless you stood practically in the flames, you still froze. Those romantic winter portraits of monarchs in fur, trimmed robes are, in reality, portraits of people trying not to sneeze icicles. As you breathe in the stale, smoky air, you can't help calculating strategies. Sleep in daytime to conserve firewood, rise earlier to avoid frostbite hauling water. Gather in groups because body heat is free and renewable. You could almost picture medieval survival as a group project, not glamorous, but sometimes the only way to squeak through the term. Children felt drafts worst, their little hands holding out to hearths as sparks jumped. Often, mothers placed them closest, hoping at least the young toes stayed warm, while adults endured the coldest corners. It's a testament to resilience that across Europe, these houses, primitive by our eyes, were enough to keep countless generations alive long enough to dream of spring. More peculiar is how, despite poor design, homes became social sanctuaries. Families huddled together, told stories, sang songs, swapped riddles, anything to stretch spirits beyond the cold four walls. That stark backdrop probably strengthened oral traditions. You didn't need books when you had cold nights to fill with tales of saints, heroes, and tricksters. The building might crumble, but the stories bounced stronger in smoky air. And as your eyes wander once more across cracked daub and rattling timbers, you realize a medieval house wasn't meant to be comfortable. It was a shield, fragile and half-effective, against bare survival's teeth. Even the walls themselves seemed to groan in sympathy, whispering encouragement, or maybe creaking threats as the frost pressed ever harder against their thin armor. The walls may creak and the fire may sputter, but the work outside never stops, just because ice decides to glue itself across every field and lane. You pull your wool cap lower, cinch your cloak tighter, and take a deep breath that tastes like frozen iron. Daily labor doesn't hibernate. It just aches a little more in winter's grip. The life of a medieval peasant is defined by motion. From sunup to sundown you're fetching, chopping, clearing, tending, hauling. In summer it's sweaty, exhausting toil. In winter, the same chores come with numb fingers and lashes of sleet. Water still has to be brought into the house. Except now it sits in buckets across frozen ground, and the well rope shrieks under frost when you lower it. Animals need feeding even when hay is scarce, so you trudge out, kicking through snowdrifts taller than your boots, swinging armfuls of straw that barely count as fodder. Your hands redden, crack, sting. Gloves, only if you're fortunate. Most peasants simply wrapped fabric strips around their wrists and tightened them, hoping at least the wind would be deceived. Wood is the true lifeline. No neat logs stacked by a suburban fireplace. This is hauling gnarled branches from frozen woods, cutting clumsy sections with axes dulled by months of use. Fact, some medieval households burned peat or dried dung patties instead, not just wood, because forests were thinner than you imagine. Historians still argue whether medieval deforestation during the Middle Ages worsened winters by reducing the windbreak effect. Forests naturally give, or if it simply shifted fuel burdens onto other resources. Either way, you're bending your back, hauling heavy bundles through snow that gets into the seams of your cloak no matter how tightly you tie it. Quirky tidbit: when water troughs froze solid, peasants sometimes thawed them by dropping hot stones into the ice. Imagine the hiss and steam, like a medieval magic trick, except you're just trying to convince your cow to stop glaring at you for withholding drink. The cow stares unimpressed. Other tasks persist: repairing roofs battered by wind, replacing thatch dislodged by snow, clearing paths so carts don't tip. Tools seize up with frost, rope threads stiffen like iron rods. And animals don't stop producing milk or waste. So milking hands freeze while scraping frozen manure becomes another giggling subject for village children. Yet laughter is scarce because everything aches, turning daily life into a cold endurance match. Even children chip in, scavenging twigs, carrying kindling, collecting whatever edible scraps guard the frosted hedges, herbs, roots, maybe a hidden nut if lucky. You admire their resilience, even as you know those raw little hands feel the sting tenfold. Now shift your gaze upward for wealthier laborers working in a state. Winter demanded transport of supplies to castles, like barrels of oil or salted meat. Carts creaked and slid across icy lanes, oxen snorted clouds. Drivers cursed wildly because one slip could tip precious food into the slush. Nobles expected supplies regardless of weather, and if your cart broke, you didn't just lose your wares, you risked losing your only ox. Those who managed, however, sometimes found camaraderie on these journeys. Two drivers meeting at a fork might share bread crusts, jokes, or complaints about frozen toes. Because nothing bonds strangers faster than shared frostbite. For women, household work weighed equally. Washing clothes near rivers in summer already rough. Try it in January, where you stoop over a hole chopped in frozen water, dipping garments until your wrists burn with cold like they've been swapped for icicles. Soap was barely available. Sometimes ashes or sand had to do. The results weren't glamorous, but at least the dirt dislodged enough to earn a faint improvement. Then it's back to drying garments by smoky hearth, where they come out stiff, smelling faintly of firewood and goat. A fashion magazine would never approve, but survival rarely wins style contests. A curious seasonal rhythm emerged. Winter slowed farm labor in fields, sure, but wood cutting intensified. Repairs to tools took priority, animals received longer care. And when storms penned people in, spinning wool, mending clothes, carving wooden tools, all indoor tasks, filled cold afternoons. Work never ceased, it just shifted costume. In monasteries, the scene tilted differently. Monks trudged icy cloisters, still expected to tend gardens enclosed within walls, or copy manuscripts by flickering light, hands trembling over parchment. At least monasteries had some architectural advantages: better stone, thicker walls, storage cellars brimming with preserved foods. Still, monks kept strict daily routines, which meant prayers in unheated chapels that echoed like glaciers. And discipline meant no whining about cold toes. You, however, are not a monk, so feel free to whine liberally. Even nobility grudgingly lifted hands. Woodland hunts in winter doubled as food supply missions, with servants beating brush through snow as lords loosed arrows at deer already weakened by hunger. If prey was found, it was dragged back amid fanfare. If not, the cold walk home was long indeed. And castle kitchens steamed as bakers kneaded harder than ever to stretch grain into daily bread for dozens of mouths. Luxury had its limits, but wealth broadened those limits richly. Still, no matter the class, you understand winter doesn't excuse you. It doubles down. You scrape, haul, scoop, repair, and carry. By evening, your back aches, your hands throb, but rest only half rests you. Because tomorrow the chores reset. Medieval life has no snow day. Snow just added weight to everything else. You climb into bed with muscles humming, exhaustion, straw rustling, and realize survival isn't only about food or warmth. It's about labor so endless it blots out time. About refusing to freeze even when your body insists on giving up. And in that half, light between sleep and wake, you imagine spring. Not because chores will vanish, but because maybe, just maybe, the work will stop hurting quite so sharply. After the endless grind of labor and the aching boredom of cold nights, one thing finally flickers like a lantern in the darkness: celebration. Even in the bleakness of February, people somehow found slivers of joy bright enough to cut through the ice. Imagine trudging home from your chores, hands red, stomach hollow, and suddenly the whole village decides tonight they're going to dance, feast, and laugh as though the snow isn't trying to murder everyone. Medieval winters were not all drudgery. They had games, festivals, and moments that felt like sunshine borrowed ahead of spring. The most obvious highlight: midwinter feasts. Christmas was, of course, a cornerstone. By the Middle Ages, it stretched far longer than our modern one-day holiday. The 12 days of Christmas were celebrated as an extended binge of food, drink, and merriment that frankly made life tolerable. Even peasants who endured bark bread in regular months might sample better fare at a communal feast, where nobles or monasteries sponsored meals. Fact: in some towns, Christmas celebrations included distributing meat, ale and bread to poorer households as alms, partly charity and partly social obligation. Historians still argue whether this generosity was genuinely heartfelt or mostly a clever way to maintain social order by preventing famished peasants from revolting at Christmas. Either way, you weren't complaining. You'd happily trade loyalty for pork stew after weeks of soup thin enough to be mistaken for hot water. Then came Twelfth Night, Epiphany, and a series of smaller observances sprinkled through January and February. The Feast of Fools, for instance, was an irreverent spectacle where roles could be reversed, parody flourished, and licensed chaos gave peasants some comic relief. Imagine the local priest parodied by drunk villagers wearing pig masks, or a farmhand dressing as Lord of Misrule and solemnly issuing decrees like chickens should be given voting rights. Quirky, yes, but when reality is stone bread and snowdrifts, silliness is survival. Outdoors, even in teeth chattering cold, games thundered forward. Children lobbed snowballs, primitive, but a timeless pastime. Adults sometimes got in on it too, escalating until hands stung and someone fell laughing into a snowdrift. In some places, villagers organized sled races on improvised sledges made from barrels or planks. Ever tumble hard on an icy hill? Congratulations, you've just reenacted medieval extreme sports, minus the medical insurance. Hunting, off a necessity, turned into sport for nobles. In winter, they launched grand hunts. Wolves, deer, wild boar. The pageantry was astounding. Fur-clad riders galloping across frozen landscapes while dogs barked thunder into snowy forests. For peasants, the chase seemed glamorous. For nobles, it staved off cabin fever. If you were lucky and sneaky, you might snare a rabbit or gather a handful of winter berries without getting accused of poaching. Town records suggest many peasants risked illicit hunts. Regardless, it was either risk fines or let their kids gnaw at wood chips. Indoor games cropped up too. Dice threw clatters onto rough-hewn tables, children played with little carved animals, and songs erupted to pass frosty nights. Music became an anchor during these months, whether it was carols echoing at churches or bawdy tunes in taverns. Lutes, fiddles, drums, simple instruments drove feet stomping hard enough to thaw frozen toes. The smoky air quivered with laughter. Festivities weren't luxuries, they were ventilation for human spirits pushed to the brink. Quirky tidbit. On particularly harsh winters, some villages on rivers that froze solid held impromptu fairs right on the ice. The Frozen Thames in London is legendary for this. Picture stalls set up across the slick glass surface, selling pastries or trinkets, while jugglers slip spectacularly into crowds. Someone roasting oxen on the ice, someone else hawking spiced wine, everyone nervously ignoring the haunting creaks beneath. A festival on borrowed time, one crack away from chaos, yet utterly irresistible. Of course, religion flavored many gatherings. Candlemas in early February was a hopeful holiday, blending pagan traditions marking lengthening daylight with Christian ritual. Candles blessed that day symbolized a light against the darkness. Villagers clutched them like mini talismans. Revels often combined sacred and silly. Villagers leaving church might immediately break into dances or casual competitions. Faith didn't erase hardship, but it painted hardships with streaks of meaning strong enough to keep hearts buoyant. And laughter amplified even mundane play. Adults created jokes from scarcity. We'll feast on rabbit stew tonight. Just as soon as the rabbit shows up, it reminded everyone that 10 thin carrots could become a banquet story if spun with enough humor. Historians still argue whether these winter festivals were primarily driven by religious mandates or by psychological necessity, a structured permission slip to release pent-up stress. What's certain is that these bursts of festivity cut like fire through the blizzard. For once, you chewed food without rationing every bite, and belly laughs came easier than coughs. As you lie down that night, cheeks sore from laughing and muscles tired from dancing in smoke, thick air, you realize joy was as deliberate as any labor. Villagers carved out fun because fun was fuel, and though winter is long, these small revolts of happiness are what carried people through the frost to another dawn. The laughter from games and feasts carries you through a few days, but then the chill reminds you of another shadow crouching in every medieval winter sickness. Cold air gnaws on lungs, bodies run thin on vitamins, and the very act of shutting oneself inside smoky cottages packs germs together like bad roommates who never leave. You cough once, then twice, and suddenly you're calculating whether you've caught just a sniffle or something more menacing. Respiratory illnesses dominated these seasons. Think rough throats, hacking coughs, fevers that burned even while your body shook with chills. Pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza, like outbreaks all reared up when people were forced indoors, clustered shoulder to shoulder with livestock and neighbors. Fact: medieval records describe waves of winter catarrh, meaning congestion and fever that swept entire communities. Few distinctions existed between modern medical categories. They were all just winter agues, treatment, hot broth and faith. Pretty sure most medieval doctors would have prescribed stay warm as often as they muttered Latin. But winters birth stranger plagues too. Quirky tidbit. The much feared St. Anthony's fire, linked to ergot poisoning, often flared worse in winter, when moldy rye flour eaten in desperation delivered hallucinogenic toxins. Imagine people, already weak from hunger, suddenly seeing visions of demons leaping across rafters while their limbs burned with painful spasms. Monasteries dedicated to St. Anthony did exist, offering medical aid to sufferers, but you had to survive the trek there first. That's like running a marathon on frozen feet while trying not to scream from phantom fire. Historians still argue whether wintertime mortality was primarily due to epidemics running rampant in cramped spaces, or whether hunger and cold themselves created weakened bodies that disease only finished off. Likely it was the nasty handshake of all three, playing together like some terrible medieval boy band Cold, Famine, and Plague on their World Misery tour. Inside your cottage, the air is heavy with smoke, stale breath, and the occasional sneeze so dramatic it rattles the rafters. With no efficient ventilation, the place becomes both a shelter and a petri dish. Children pass coughs to adults, adults pass them back. Even the goats sniffle through frosted noses. A tub of water simmers on the hearth, releasing steam for healing, though it's as effective as a placebo tea bag bobbing in today's fever. Still, the warmth feels kind, and kindness counts. And speaking of remedies, medieval medicine leaned more toward kitchen experiments than pharmaceutical precision. Honey mixed with vinegar, onions steeped in oil, herbal salves rubbed on chests or feet. Sometimes these had merit. Garlic and honey really do have antimicrobial properties. Other times, dried toad powder was suggested for plague sores, because clearly if you grind up a frog, your lungs will cough less. Always worth a shot when you're desperate, unless you're the toad. Diseases like smallpox and measles hit in winter as well, tearing through populations when movement outdoors was reduced but close contact indoors increased. Villagers often blamed divine wrath, coughed too hard, and someone might suggest your household harbored divine punishment. Faith and fear blurred together, so illness wasn't just medical, it was moral. Suffering was framed as trial, test, or curse. That didn't cure you, but it gave you a script to read while lying on straw beds, counting beams overhead, waiting either for relief or release. Still, human creativity stubbornly surfaced. Some villagers believed charms could keep winter sickness at bay, sprigs of evergreen pinned to door lintels, or bright red yarn stringed across beams to trap coughing demons. You might laugh, but honestly, compared with licking frog powder, hanging some pine seems fairly sensible. The psychological weight also pressed down. In winter, depression lingers, not easily named, yet present in chronic fatigue and sorrow. Whereas today we talk about seasonal affective disorder, medieval folk simply experienced gloom as another heavy cloak. The fires felt dimmer, illnesses silent companions. Community singing or storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was an antidote against despair, a kind of medieval group therapy disguised as carols. Monasteries occasionally provided sanctuary, with infirmaries better stocked with herbs, warmer bedding, cleaner diets. But even monks were not immune. Record books note entire cloisters reduced by outbreaks. One can imagine rows of shivering friars wrapped in habits, chanting prayers even when their lungs wheezed like bellows. Noble households faced similar threats, albeit cushioned with more food, thicker walls, and slightly improved care. Physicians attended them, armed with knowledge of humus too much, phlegm, meant a cold imbalance, calling for warming foods, spices, and maybe a goblet of hot mulled wine. Spice imports from warmer lands made noble cures taste a lot fancier than peasant brews, but their effectiveness remained about equal. You still coughed until your ribs ached. The cycle was relentless. Cold leads to hunger, hunger weakens bodies, sickness slips in, and you're left wrestling for breath in the depths of winter. If one person succumbed, the family often followed. One spark can turn a cottage into a fire, or in this case, a fever pit. And there were no clean hospitals or ambulances, just neighbors shuffling over with broth and prayers, hoping their presence did more help than harm. Yet even amid sickness, hope lingered. People told stories of miraculous recoveries, of saints stepping in, of springs thawing fever as much as snow. Whether science or spirit, holding on to belief that sickness would pass was itself a survival tactic. You could almost hear whispers around the hearth at night. Hold on, just make it until spring. So you choke out another cough, pull the blanket higher, and tuck closer to the fire, knowing sickness is every bit as much part of winter as snow, and hoping stubbornly that you'll live to meet the thaw. The air is still heavy with coughs from those long winters, but now your mind drifts to the single most obvious defense humans had against cold clothing. You've layered everything you can find, yet somehow your toes still feel like they're plotting mutiny. And here comes the harsh reality. Medieval clothing was never truly designed with coziness in mind. Function beat fashion, though sometimes fashion tried to sneak in and often stumbled hilariously. Your base layer, wool, so much wool, scratchy, clingy wool that rubbed like sandpaper against your neck. In fact, wool was the medieval equivalent of today's polyester, ubiquitous, cheap-ish, and used for everything from underclothes to cloaks. Spun by hand, woven on cottage looms, dyed in muted shades if you could afford it. Wool insulates somewhat, especially if layered, but in wet weather Esseru, and let's be honest, snow is just rain with an attitude problem. It soaks through, leaving you chafed and soggy. Still, peasants clutched their wool tunics and hose like lifelines. Over that, you'd wear furs if you were lucky, fox, rabbit, or sheep pelt if you were a commoner sable ermine, or lynx if you were nobility looking to both warm your shins and flex your bank account. Fact: the English, sumptuary laws, sometimes specifically restricted certain fur types to the upper classes, partially to maintain status distinctions. Historians still argue whether these laws were strictly enforced or used more as an intimidation tool to remind peasants not to get too cozy. If you were caught parading in ermine when you were supposed to be in plain sheepskin, it turned into a kind of medieval fashion police moment. Shoes, a whole agony on their own. Most were soft leather, thin-soled, and nowhere near waterproof. Snow seeped through within minutes, and feet, your body's little radiators, went numb fast. To fix this, peasants stuffed straw inside, which helped absorb moisture and added insulation. Quirky tidbit: in Scandinavia, some stuffed their footwear with dried moss instead, creating an earthy odor but surprisingly effective insulation. Imagine modern sneaker tech's little air pockets, except replace them with clumps of forest floor. On your head, a hood or coif, a snug linen cap often covered ears. Because let's face it, nobody's surviving with frozen earlobes. Cloaks made of wool or fur draped over shoulders, often clasped with simple pins. These were not stylish capes swishing like superhero fashion, more like lumpen blankets that trailed snow whenever you trudged. Still, they were precious. Sell your cloak, and you might as well sell your mortality insurance. Nobles and royalty turned winter clothing into statements. Their robes trailed long, stitched with exotic furs, trimmed with bright fabrics imported from places peasants hadn't even heard of. But don't be fooled. No amount of ermine fully defeated England's February draft. Kings were still freezing, just while looking fabulous. And nobles sometimes wore ridiculous pointed shoes, called polanes, which were so long at the tip they curled up. Can you picture trudging through 6 inches of snow in clown toes? Function: zero, fashion disaster disguised as footwear. A resounding yes. You almost feel like giving them a slow clap for commitment to looking impractical. No discussion of clothing is complete without hose. Tight, fitting leg coverings, kind of like medieval leggings. You wore them under tunics held up with garters or laces. They sagged, slipped, tore constantly, yet they helped keep frostbite at bay. You sometimes patched them with whatever scrap was available, resulting in patchwork chic, centuries before thrift, core aesthetics became cool. Women layered shifts, long underdresses of linen, with wool gowns over top, girdled with belts to keep excess fabric tucked in. A kerchief or veil might be wrapped around head and neck like a medieval scarf. Warm, adequate at best, practical. More so, since linen could be washed easier, preserving hygiene somewhat. But still nothing modern cozy. The idea of fleece-lined sweatpants would have seemed like sorcery. Cold injuries flourished anyway. Feet frostbitten, ears blackened, fingers stiff. Children bundled in, every scrap still shivered. Cloth couldn't fully combat frigid homes or outdoor chores. And yet, communities adapted. They layered obsessively, wore everything they had at once, so much so that villages sometimes looked like waddling bundles instead of humans. Historians love debating whether medieval wardrobes were adequate for climates like the Little Ice Age. Some point to wool's amazing insulating powers when spun thick, plus cultural knowledge about layering. Others note the sheer frequency of frostbite injuries and chronic illness from exposure. Probably truth sat somewhere in between. Clothing was just enough to limp through winters, but never enough to make them easy. Quirky details even creep into folklore. Some writings praise sheepskin boots as charms of warmth. Others describe charcoal pockets, sewn into clothing, literally little sacks of hot coals carried against the body, a fire hazard disguised as fashion hack. Imagine telling today's fire marshals that strapping burning embers under your cloak is innovative design. Practical, barely. Risky. Oh yes! To their defense, if you were already half frozen, the idea probably sounded genius. Back in your smoky cottage, the family huddles, dressed layer over awkward layer. Clothes stiff with soot and sweat, patched so often you barely remember the original fabric. Still, in those creases and hems is survival, and perhaps a bit of quiet beauty. Colorful dyes if you're luckier, embroidered cuffs, little glimpses of individuality amid sameness. People weren't trying to look glamorous. They were just trying to make another morning. So you bundle every scrap tighter, tighten your straw stuffed shoes, and stomp into another icy dawn. The wool itches, the fur smells, the cloak drags, but the outfit bears witness to generations leaning on the one thread they had. Wrap yourself, laugh a little, and hope the seams hold until spring. You tug at your bundle of wool layers and straw stuffed shoes, sighing at the itch. But now winter sets you on a new trial, moving from one place to another. Because no matter how much you'd prefer to burrow in your smoky cottage until April, life demands motion. Trade has to continue, messages need carrying, and someone always insists on hauling barrels, sacks, or livestock across icy roads. Travel and trade in the deep freeze. This is where medieval life became both daring and absurd. The first thing you notice, the roads are not your friend. Medieval roads, even in sunny months, were little more than mud veins carved across the countryside. In December, they froze rigid, cracked open, or transformed into slick death slides. Wheel ruts hardened like jagged tracks of stone, making carts groan as their axles splintered. If the thaw came early, those ruts returned to knee-deep mud, swallowing boots and animal hooves with a sucking sound that every traveler cursed. Fact: surviving records from medieval Europe complain endlessly about road quality. Petitions to kings and councils begging for better paving were as routine as modern pothole complaints. Historians still argue whether governments truly neglected maintenance, or whether medieval travel was simply doomed by climate extremes no one could efficiently fix. And you, just a simple soul, are trudging along anyway. If you've got something to sell at market, you pack it on your back, or if your family rich enough, load it on a donkey or ox cart. That animal might balk at icy hills, slipping belly first into drifts. A day intended as one journey to town might stretch into two because your ox decides snow tastes better than progress. Quirky tidbit: in some areas of Scandinavia, people took advantage of the snow rather than fighting it, building primitive sledges or skis for winter travel. Yes, skis! Archaeologists have found evidence of wooden skis several thousand years old, used as practical snow transport rather than hip recreation. Picture an overworked peasant sliding shakily down a slope with a sack of grain, landing in a snowbank. Congratulations, you've just invented medieval slapstick skiing. Merchants faced special gambles. They needed to move goods. Wool from English shires, wine from France, salt from coastal towns. Despite slush, snow, and frozen rivers. Crossing rivers was tricky in mild winters. Ferries slowed. In freezing winters, whole fleets of boats were stuck in ice. On rare occasions, frozen river routes actually helped merchants. Thick enough ice allowed wagons to cross more directly, skipping bridges. Of course, sometimes the ice gave way mid-journey, leaving your cart of barrels bobbing sadly in the frigid current. Nothing saws a day faster than losing not only your wine shipment, but also your dignity in front of gawking villagers. Inside towns, tradespeople adjusted. Markets shrank since fewer dared venture in, but the scarcity of goods often drove prices higher. That sack of grain you struggled to drag through snow, worth more once you staggered into a market square, shivering with icicles in your beard but triumphant in profit. Commerce bent, but it didn't freeze entirely. Merchant resilience was half survival, half stubbornness. Travel posed even greater perils at night. Forget street lamps. Paths plunged into blackness, and snow could cover markers so you wandered in circles. Wolves, yes, still patrolled some regions, padding close to prey upon weakened livestock or distracted travelers. Lighting a torch helped, but there's nothing quite like trying to hold a flaming stick in one hand while steering a donkey through snowdrifts with the other. Multitasking, medieval edition, pilgrimages, a huge part of medieval devotion, didn't stop for weather either. Imagine trudging barefoot some miles because vow or poverty dictated, snow crunching painfully underfoot. Pilgrimage accounts mention freezing rains and swollen feet. Yet trudging continued, because the promise of blessings outweighed frostbite. Historians still argue whether such pilgrimages were acts of true devotion, or also practical opportunities. Winter travel let peasants beg meals on the road when their home larders emptied. Maybe both. It's amazing how survival and faith often overlapped. What about nobility? They had horse-drawn carriages, more servants to haul them, better cloaks. But picture wooden wheels caught in frozen ruts, cloaks whipping in wind so sharp it sliced faces. Castles still had to receive food messages, correspondence, all by human or animal effort. Luxury travel simply meant dipping into discomfort at a higher altitude on horseback. Sailors didn't rest either. Coastal towns sometimes launched ships late into the year. Ice-glazed decks, frost-slowed rigging, and storms made seas murderous. Yet salt shipments, essential for preserving food, had to move. Stranded crews might huddle at ports abroad, praying for calmer seas to sail home. Imagine being crammed onto a wooden ship smelling like fish oil and sweat, pitching in wintry gales. Suddenly trudging through mud looks glamorous. Quirky experiment. Some towns organize communal ice clearing brigades when winter markets mattered. Men and women hacked chunks of ice from rivers to allow ferries through, then hauled those ice blocks back for storage. Wealthier households saw use in them months later. Primitive refrigeration. You suffer now so some noble can keep summer wine chilled. Lucky you. And so, wrapped in layer upon layer, you keep trudging. Feet wet, cart creaking, hands numb around ropes. But you keep moving, because travel wasn't optional. Grain won't walk itself to market. Barrels won't roll themselves to the castle cellars. Commerce staggered, faltered, but never ceased, even under winter's fist. Somewhere down this snowy path, markets bustle faintly, promising you coin, food, or just the comfort of faces not seen in weeks. Winter made travel and trade an ordeal, but also a thread of connection, one village meeting another. One family surviving because someone dared cross the ice. The road may be cruel, but it binds lives together even while biting you with frost. Your boots crunch against the brittle snow crust, and as the road narrows between skeletal oaks, another truth about medieval winters rises. The way people thought about the season itself. Cold wasn't just weather, it was a test, a spiritual drama, almost a battleground between human frailty and divine will. Faith and fear braided together. giving the bleak months a meaning beyond aching joints and empty bellies. You don't just shiver here, you contemplate what the shivers mean. To a medieval villager, every season sat inside God's timetable, and winter was no exception. When snow smothered fields or floods iced up rivers, peasants might well view it as a holy trial, a yearly ordeal granted by heaven to purify souls. Priests preached endurance as faith made visible: keep fasting, keep praying, keep trusting, for spring will be the reward. Candlelight processions lit up village lanes, with wax taper flames flickering bravely against pitch skies. The symbolism was clear, tiny lights waging war against enormous darkness. Fact, churches often timed feasts or fasts to anchor communities through these months. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas weren't just holy dates. They broke up the psychological burden of endless dark. Historians still argue whether the church designed this calendar rhythm deliberately to combat seasonal despair, or whether it was coincidence that religious observances clustered so conveniently in midwinter. Either way, the faithful entered sanctuaries that glowed warm with fire and chant, a rare refuge from the howling cold outside. And then there were omens, quirky tidbit. Villagers sometimes read animal behaviors as winter prophecies. If a raven perched close to the house, it could signify a death before thaw. Cats curling near fire might warn of storms. Superstition lurked everywhere like frost around every beam. Candle smoke dreams. Even the snap of kindling could be assigned meaning. When survival felt that precarious, every hint, real or imagined, loomed colossal. You sit in a church pew carved rough, listening to the priest's voice echo off stone. Behind you, families huddle, clutching their blessed candles from candlemas, believing the wax will guard households from lightning sickness, or worse yet, crop failure after thaw. Faith was not only solace, it was insurance. Better than moss in shoes and warmer than wool cloaks was hope that divine protection saw you through. Yet faith was laced with fear. Famine, illness, and the sheer brutality of ice became wrapped in narratives of punishment. Maybe the community sinned. Perhaps a neighbor angered heaven. Medieval logic was rarely, fair, that's weather. Instead, storm and snow often acquired cosmic weight. Divine trial or demonic attack, depending who you asked. Mystics amplified this drama in records. Some holy men and women claimed visions of winters as metaphors for souls under attack. One nun described January fog as the devil's breath smothering faith. Others spoke of radiant beams in snowy woods as glimpses of Christ. While most villagers focused on barley soup and dry feet, these spiritual reports reinforced the idea. Winter wasn't meaningless hardship. It was a sermon frozen into the landscape. It's easy to scoff from modern heating, but pause a moment you're a villager. Your stomach hollow, your uncle coughing beside you, your house whistling with drafts. Wouldn't you crave meaning in the misery? Wouldn't you want to believe the frost was for something, not just a joke of nature? That belief kept people from collapsing flat in despair. Communities also built rituals around warding off evil in the cold. Bonfires were common, blazing heaps lit not just for warmth, but as defiance against dark spirits. Some sang carols not only to celebrate, but to keep away misfortune. And travelers prayed to saints. Saint Christopher for safe journeys, Blaise for throat ailments, before daring icy paths. Survival and spirituality overlapped until you could barely see where one ended and the other began. Of course, not everyone agreed on interpretation. Historians still debate whether peasants genuinely believed every snowstorm was loaded with cosmic intention, or whether many kept a more practical, shrugging attitude, with faith layering symbolic comfort, but not defining all thought. The truth likely varied for some. Suffering demanded cosmic script; for others, it was just lousy weather with poor insulation. Still, the faith structure steadied behavior. You could keel over from cold, but while alive, you had a ritual frame explaining trials as steps toward higher reward. Imagine how deeply Candlemas candles flickering in village windows pierced the dark. A physical marker that winter was not chaos, but calendar, moving towards spring by divine promise. And so you end that snowy evening whispering prayers. glancing suspiciously at your neighbor's cat. Did it curl too close to the hearth? And trusting that tomorrow, somehow, would bring survival. Winter was never just endured with cloaks and chores. It was endured through stories, omens, and rites that made frost look like theater scripted by the heavens. Snow still drapes the fields, but something in the air feels different. The wind's howl softens into a sigh, icicles drip like ticking clocks, and beneath the brittle crust, water stirs restless. After months of enduring hunger, smoke, filled rooms, and cracked knuckles, the medieval winter begins to loosen its grip. The thaw is coming, not instantly, not mercifully, but slowly, as though winter itself grumbles before conceding defeat. You step outside one dawn and hear birdsong stitched faintly through the melting chill. It's the promise at last spring. Imagine the awe. Dark months have trained you to survive on bark bread, straw-stuffed boots, and hope that didn't always stretch far. Suddenly mud replaces snow, green shoots jab upwards, streams run freely again. The landscape pivots from monochrome misery into messy rebirth, slush, puddles, and mud-spattered hems. Not glamorous, but gloriously alive. Fields that seemed dead for eternity are tugged back to duty. Peasants dig tools from storage, plows groan forward once more. Hunger still stalks, though. The end of winter was notorious for being the hungry gap. Grain stores are gone, animals weak, yet new crops haven't matured. Fact: many medieval deaths from famine fell not in deep January, but in March and April. The cruelest trick of all, when survival felt near, but food still lagged weeks behind. Historians still argue whether communities truly celebrated early spring with joy or more with grim determination, working furiously to bridge those weeks until the first edible greens arrived. Still, even hardship couldn't dim relief. Quirky tidbit: villagers sometimes threw small celebrations at the season's first flowers, using them as tokens to ward off lingering winter sickness. A single daffodil in a jug might feel like luxury, a trophy proving cruel ice hadn't won. Nobles marked the season with hunts more frequent, and symbolic processions proclaiming dominion over landscape restored. Whereas peasants dug furrows, nobles strutted with falcons or paraded through blooming orchards. Both, at heart, declared the same messagey: life had returned, and with it, the declaration that their winter ordeal hadn't destroyed them. For the church, Easter became the spectacular centerpiece. Resurrection paired perfectly with thaw. Sermons brimmed with imagery of seeds bursting forth as Christ had from the tomb. Faith and soil blended naturally. To plant was to believe. Ritual, labor, and survival braided into the same rope, hauling civilization out of frozen despair. The thaw didn't erase pain, but it draped it with perspective. Winter scars, rag coughs, barns emptied, frost-bitten toes, remained reminders that humans are fragile. Yet here you stand, boots squelching in mud, watching fields breathe again. Just weeks ago, you measured life in sips of broth and flickers of smoky firelight. Now the world hums with revival. Historians emphasize that the medieval year was cyclical. Every thaw carried victory, but also fresh foreboding. You knew another brutal winter lurked later down the calendar. And still, survival itself was proof of success. Every village that staggered out of snow carrying stories, songs, and scars had passed the test again. And whether people credited God omens or sheer stubborn willpower, the message was the same: to endure winter was to earn spring's fragile triumph. So, as muddy waters surge and lambs wobble in fields, you snap free from the frozen clench. Winter has been long, cruel, relentless. But your breath is no longer steam in an endless night. It's laughter under an encouraging sky, proof that even in brutal centuries, hope thawed alongside the rivers. Now let the pace drift slower, softer. Think of the snow melting into quiet rivulets, water trickling lazily across stones. The harsh winds fade, replaced by a gentler breeze that threads through budding branches. You picture yourself no longer trudging through icy ruts, but reclining in a meadow where grass leans softly, touched by sunlight. Every detail eases, sounds blur, colors loosen, and heavy memories slide off like melting icicles. The season's brutality, the hunger, the coughing dark, the aching sameness of chores. all of it resigned now to history. What remains is the triumph of those who endured. Houses were flimsy, food was scant, clothing itchy, roads treacherous, but resilience carried people forward. And resilience, like spring, feels eternal. You feel it too, blooming gently inside your chest with that first deep breath that no longer hurts. Visualize those villagers celebrating, Thor laughter ringing across muddy lanes, candles flickering in chapels, children chasing each other again in fields no longer lined with frost. That joy can become yours, quiet and nourishing, washing away tension like snow washed from rooftops. In this moment, the story dissolves into calm. You're no longer pressed by the weight of survival, but wrapped in a blanket of reassurance. The frost has ended. The fire burns gentle, its warmth neither desperate nor harsh, just steady. And as spring flowers stretch themselves upwards, you stretch too, into rest, into peace. So close your eyes, settle deeper into the quiet, and let the echoes of medieval winters drift distant. Outside, wind hums softly, no longer cruel but calm. You're safe, you're warm, you're steady. And like those long ago villagers, you've made it through night into soft, forgiving dawn.